Good evening, Palo Alto. How's everybody doing this evening? There we go. There we go. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this needed conversation for our community. My name is the Reverend Coloma A. Smith. I'm the pastor of a little church right down the street, less than a block, called University AME Zion Church. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things. This is actually an official city meeting. So we're going to have to do some technical things, like we have to do a roll call and a check-in. So as we work through that part, just give us about 3 minutes. And the important thing about it being an official city meeting is that when we get to question and answers, I'll need you to say your name so that the person that's taking minutes can write the names and write the comments so that they go in the official city record. Thank you.
Okay, Mary, roll call, please. Here. And there's just one other piece of business. If anybody has any oral comments that are not on the agenda. If anybody wants to make oral comments on a subject not on the agenda, fill out a speaker card and you'll have a chance to speak. Otherwise, we'll go right into our program.
Well, thank you so much for being with us this evening. One of the things I love about Palo Alto is that you are a community that cares. The interesting thing is that this conversation on implicit bias is a mirror conversation. It's not a conversation about blame. It's not a conversation that is driven by some mass shooting in the country. As a community, we have decided to come together and have an honest and frank discussion. So as we have this conversation tonight, this is not about blame, this is not about pointing, but this is more about a mirror or reflective moment. I'd love to have Councilman Berman, one of our more progressive councilmen, come forward. This is I like this guy. He definitely is one of the catalysts to this conversation. So we'd love for him to give us a few words before we start.
Well, thank you very much, Pastor Smith, and thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Mark Berman. I serve on the Palo Alto City Council, and I want to thank all of you for joining us for being different together, experiencing Palo Alto, perception, and reality. This is the fourth in a series of really amazing community forums that have been organized by the Palo Alto Human Relations Commission, and you heard the commissioners' names earlier, but I want to give all of them a round of applause, and in particular Valerie Stinger, who's organized tonight's event. And really put in so much time, and all of our board members and commissioners in Palo Alto devote countless hours behind the scenes to make our community what it is today, and so I'm very grateful to all of them, so thank you guys very much. Tonight's forum is especially meaningful to me. Growing up in Palo Alto in the 80s and 90s, I had friends of all races and from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, and while I didn't really realize it at the time, those experiences really shaped the values that I hold today. As Pastor Smith mentioned, there might be more progressive values. And I worry that we're losing this socioeconomic diversity in Palo Alto, and that the diverse groups that we do have aren't really coming together to form a stronger community. But I do see a glimmer of hope, and it comes from increased dialogue throughout our community about what can sometimes be awkward and touchy issues, like implicit bias. Implicit bias can be experienced in all walks of life, from healthcare to housing, and even in education. Just last year, the education nonprofit that I used to work for supported state legislation that was aimed at ending implicit bias in course placement for students in California public schools. Because studies have shown, and I see this, some folks know what I'm talking about, studies have shown that Latino and African American students are repeating coursework at much higher rates than their Caucasian and Asian peers, even if they show the same aptitude, do as well on the same tests, and get similar grades in school. And so it's really important that we be cognizant about these issues, and put systems in place to end these types of implicit bias. Tonight's discussion is a continuation of important community conversations that while it might not be because of, it happened after the really senseless killing of 9 African-American church members by a white supremacist in Charleston, South Carolina. Soon after this tragedy, I was invited to attend a forum held by Pastor Coloma Smith, the at that time fairly new pastor of University AME Zion Church in Palo Alto. And this was a forum for community members to discuss their experiences with prejudice and both overt and implicit bias. Wow. This was one of the most powerful community forums that I've been to, both before and during my time on the Palo Alto City Council. It was, and it sparked a conversation about racism and prejudice that there was clearly an overwhelming desire to have in the broader Palo Alto and I think kind of peninsula community. This was also the first time that I saw Pastor Coloma Smith in action. Wow again. Pastor Smith's ability to navigate an emotional conversation on a controversial topic, ending on time, which I was very impressed by. And that doesn't happen at city council meetings. Ending on time and weaving the wide-ranging conversation into tangible next steps was really remarkable. I'm excited to watch Pastor Smith moderate today's really fantastic panel. Before we get to that, I want to let everyone know about the community participation piece of tonight's meeting. So some of you might have noticed there's big poster papers along the windows. And if you have a program, and hopefully everybody does, in the middle of the program, there's an opportunity for everybody to write down their thoughts as we go through tonight's conversation. At the end of the meeting, everybody will have an opportunity to write down their thoughts on these different areas and put them on sticky notes and add those to the big pieces of paper against the window. My city council colleague, Corey Wolbach, will give everyone more instruction at that time. But be thinking of that as we're going through the conversation. And if you hear something that kind of brings an idea to mind or a thought or emotion to mind, write that down so that you can remember it at the end of the meeting. So without further ado, it's my privilege to hand the mic back over to my friend Coloma Smith, pastor of University AME Zion Church. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everybody. A critical thing about the writing, the notes you're going to take tonight are going to be part of an art project that's going to go in City Hall. So these thoughts and these ideas that you have will not be wasted. Also, all the comments and everything are being filmed, so they are going down for posterity. So we really want to make this discussion engaging, important, and relevant. I now have the pleasure, one other thing. In preparation for this, we did a video testimonial. 2 interesting results came out of the testimonial talking about implicit bias. The first is we had some really brave people that shared some amazing stories. Those videos are in the back. I really want you to take a look at those videos as they describe some of the things that happen in our community and the surrounding communities. It's right there where the lady with the purple top, that is Minka. So go and check out those videos. They're amazing. But the other thing that happened was that we talked to several people in the Palo Alto community, and they were a little scared. They were scared to share their experience because implicit bias is real. And they were like, I don't know what the response from my community is going to be if I share. With that said, as we share tonight, this is a safe space. People are allowed to speak. People are allowed to say what they need to say. What we're not allowed to do is shout, scream, and put anybody down for what they say. We're all right with that? Y'all don't sound like y'all are really all right. Are we all right with that? Yeah. Thank you so much. Right now, I want to bring forward somebody that has just totally impressed me. This is Dr. Joseph Brown. He is at Stanford. He is in the first gen and diversity office, but he has such a beautiful way of presenting information on implicit bias. I thought I knew a little bit about bias, but after talking to him, he really opened my eyes to see that I am biased in certain things that I do, because we each bring a bias from our background and where we come from. So he's going to do this amazing presentation, and then we're going to have our panel come forward.
Can everyone hear me? Great. So, all right, let's try again. Right. So my mother didn't raise any quiet children, so I want to thank Valerie Stinger and Pastor Smith for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. I wanted to take a tack that would be a little controversial because I wanted to talk about one of the consequences of implicit bias and the continuing influence of negative stereotypes in our communities and in our society. And to get into this, so I want to talk about microaggressions as one consequence of implicit bias and use that as a path for getting into a discussion about creating a more truly just and inclusive community. And, so implicit bias has been a controversial topic in the last few years, and microaggressions perhaps even more so. So I saw an essay by Amitai Etzioni in which he criticized the idea of microaggressions, and basically his argument was, listen, people are getting beat up, tortured, and murdered. That's what we should be focusing on. Okay. I read a couple of other essays that criticize microaggressions as sort of embracing a victim mentality. And I want to address that and address some of the causes of microaggressions. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you to think about something. So what I'd like you to do is see if you can remember a time when someone said something to you, did something to you that suggested that they weren't seeing you clearly. They were seeing you through the distorting lens of a negative stereotype about your group. Or they were being influenced by implicit biases, negative biases toward your group. And it may have been due to your gender, your race, your religious faith or lack of faith, your social class, sexual orientation. See if you can remember a time when something like that happened to you. So take a moment, see if you can come up with that memory. And I want you to think about the details of what happened. What specifically was said? What was the behavior that occurred? So take a moment to think about that. Now, I want you to think about what your thoughts were when it was happening and after it happened. And what were some of the emotions that you felt? So, would anybody be willing to share something about their experience? Let's see if we can get 2 or 3 examples. And can we get a mic?
I have a mic and I'm walking right over.
Yeah, great. Thank you. You could give us your name and
Okay. Hi, I'm Deneva. An experience I had was. Oh, is it not on? Oh, thanks. Hi, I'm Deneva. A negative experience I had was walking to my car, from my home, and there was an older Asian couple, walking in the opposite direction. So I'm walking towards my car and they're walking in the opposite direction, and then they walked across the street to avoid walking next to me, not realizing that I was walking to my car. And I have been told before from other Asian friends of mine that they're afraid of black people or that I'm different or whatever. So that's an example of something that happened to me. The feelings I felt were kind of frustration, more like, I don't know, I was offended and frustrated at the same time, and I also felt uncomfortable walking to my car.
thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, my name's Jill. This is something that happened to me when I was a little girl that made a big impression on me. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, in a very conservative time, and we had career day at my elementary school. And when the girls were asked what career they wanted, they all said they wanted to be a nurse, a teacher, or a secretary, and then they would all become moms. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to grow up and be a writer. I wanted to travel. I wanted to do other things. And when I said that, I was really publicly shamed by the teacher for being like an outcast or an outlier, because I didn't want to follow this conventional, female model that we were all programmed with. So I'm happy to say, though, I am a writer today. So
Well, congratulations. All right. Oh, one more person. Hi. Yeah. Right in front of you. Right here. Yeah, yes.
I was walking across the street and it was getting on to be early evening and it was dark. I happened to be crossing Waverly to go to my church, actually. And I saw this black man across the street and I recognized him. Actually, he was someone that I worked with and was very fond of. So I ran over, and as I came towards him, he recoiled. And I put my arms around him to give him a hug because we were that close of friends. And he said, "Oh my goodness, Gloria." He said, "I was walking down the street. I was thinking to myself, oh yeah, there's another white woman. She's going to walk across the street just to get away from me. Next thing you know, she's running towards me to give me a hug." I was totally shocked.
Thank you. So I want to draw your attention to something with those three examples. So how do you define microaggressions? They're brief, commonplace, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities. They're intentional or unintentional. They communicate derogatory, negative, or hostile slights, invalidations, and insults. So that's the official definition. But I want to draw your attention to something. So for each of these individuals that experience microaggressions, the behavior of the people doing the microaggressing may or may not have been influenced by negative stereotypes. It's not necessarily, well, actually in one instance it seems pretty clear, but because the person made a statement that seemed to suggest a gender, right, and gender stereotypes. But in most cases, it's not necessarily clear what's driving the microaggressor's behavior. But for the target, the negative stereotype about their group conditions the consideration of the microaggression and what it means or not. Part of the problem with microaggressions is, why did this happen, and was the behavior or statement driven or not driven by negative stereotypes about my group? That ambiguity is part of the problem and part of the damage that microaggressions can do. But they can only be understood by referencing the negative stereotype. So for the budding writer in the back, It was the awareness of the gender stereotypes at the time that helped her understand how damaging that statement was, right? It was the negative stereotypes about African Americans that, what was her name? That Geneva had to consider might be driving the behavior of that Asian couple. In fact, stereotypes might not have been driving their behavior. And here I want to draw a distinction between impact and intent. Because microaggressions can have a negative impact on you regardless of the intention of the microaggressor. And my colleague in the Diversity and First Gen office, Jerika Blackman, makes this point that if a Starbucks server spills hot coffee on you and you're burned, and he says, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to," well, that's great, but I'm still burned. Ouch. Right. Right. So the damage still holds. So when we're considering the impact of microaggressions, part of the problem is the attributional ambiguity around the microaggression. Because what happens, and what likely happened to the three people that talked about their experience, is that they struggled to, why did this happen? What does it mean? And how should I respond? And the damage done by the negative stereotype is that it's all too difficult for a person to dismiss the microaggression, to dismiss it from their minds. Because if that behavior or statement is driven by negative stereotypes, that has consequences. So if that Asian couple is genuinely afraid of her, that suggests that future interactions with them may not go so well, right? This has happened to me a number of times where I've been walking in a department store and I noticed that I was being followed by either the store security or the sales staff. They didn't approach me and ask me if they would follow me. Well, if that behavior is being driven by negative stereotypes about African Americans being criminals, well, that has consequences for how I'm likely to be treated by that staff. So I have to think about it. Here's the thing about negative stereotypes. So they're widely disseminated in our society, and study after study shows that part of being a good citizen is being familiar with those negative stereotypes, even if over time fewer and fewer of us endorse those stereotypes as accurate. No matter, we're familiar with those stereotypes. And here's the ugly truth that social psychology, my field, has demonstrated about those stereotypes. They affect us. They're useful. They help us resolve ambiguity. When we're preoccupied, busy, they're more likely to affect our judgments and our feelings and our behavior. But the larger point is that they're useful. They continue to be useful, but they exert their influence largely in ways that we are unaware of. If we're the targets of those negative stereotypes, then we have to consider whether the treatment that we're receiving is being conditioned by those negative stereotypes. So some of the short-term consequences of microaggressions are, for one thing, they distract us. So when you experience a microaggression, you have to devote attentional and cognitive resources to figuring out what that behavior, what those statements were about, what they mean, and how we should respond. It also taps our emotional control resources. Experiencing a microaggression and considering that that behavior was driven by negative stereotypes about my group, that's threatening. It's disturbing. And if you tell me, please, ignore it, stop paying attention to it, well, I have to devote attention to managing my emotions around that behavior. And here's the ironic short-term effect of stereotypes, of microaggressions, is that they draw a spotlight around the social identity in question. They draw attention to that social identity, race, gender, social class, sexual orientation, religious faith. At just the time when, if we bring up the microaggression and the behavior, we're likely to hear from other people, well, aren't you paying, aren't you making a little bit too much of this, right? Gender isn't everything. Race isn't everything. So imagine the irony and the dissonance experienced by targets of microaggressions, that they've had an experience that highlights that stigmatized social identity at a time where they're likely to be told that they're paying too much attention to that social identity. And what are some of the long-term consequences of a chronic experience of microaggressions? Well, what targets of microaggressions are learning is that it seems they are less likely to be seen as individuals and more likely to be seen through the distorting lens of stereotypes and the implicit biases that people have about their group. And so their trust in the local institutions, in the people that they're working with, is undermined. Right? So an increase in alienation, isolation, increased stress and distress around how we're likely to be treated in the future. And probably some of the most interesting research being done in social psychology today around these issues looks at the long-term health consequences of the consistent, continual experience of microaggressions. So what causes microaggressions? I wouldn't want to argue that overt prejudice drives most microaggressions. That's just not the case. Things have changed in America. So, what we see is that fewer and fewer people endorse negative stereotypes as accurate or valid. What has happened is that social norms have changed. And those changing social norms make microaggressions even more important for us to consider. So I'll tell you a story that my advisor, Claude Steele, told me when I was a graduate student at Stanford. So Claude Steele, prominent social psychologist who's now no longer at Stanford, he's a provost at Berkeley. Claude did his undergraduate studies at Hiram College, a small liberal arts college in Ohio. And he was one of only 7 or 8 African Americans at the college at that time. And here's what he said about that experience. He said, well, Joseph, when I was a student there, I didn't have any questions about whether I was a completely valued and included member of the campus. I knew I wasn't. I knew there were lots of people that didn't want me and other African American students there. So there wasn't an expectation of full inclusion. So I found my friends and the niches that I was comfortable in, and I did my thing and got my education. But now social norms have changed. Now to be racist is to be a bad person, to have a bad character. And our expectations, our current social norms, embrace full inclusion. But what the experience of microaggressions does is to undermine the sense that we're being treated fairly and justly. It undermines the notion that we are valued, fully included members of our communities. And that's the problem. But in fact, because we're all moving through the society, a society rife with negative stereotypes, because we're all at one time or another influenced by those negative stereotypes, we've all experienced microaggressions. We've all been the target of microaggressions, and every single one of us has been a microaggressor. Because we're all subject to the negative stereotypes that are part of our society, because we're all subject to the implicit biases that we've learned in this society. So in fact, microaggressors are potential allies in our project to create a more inclusive, a more just community and society. So how do we do that? And I could say a great deal about that, but I want to close with a concept that has been very important to us in the Diversity and First Gen office, and it's the concept of cultural humility. And I want to contrast it with the notion of cultural competence, which is, I think, which is a much more often used concept in diversity and inclusion training, and that can be associated with the learning of some important skills and important knowledge about other groups and the problem of implicit bias and microaggressions. But all too often, cultural competency can sort of morph into well, I've taken these classes and I've read these books. I'm done. I've reached it. I'm no longer part of the problem. Thank you very much. And I'm perfectly happy to consult with you with a substantial hourly rate. By contrast, what cultural humility says is that we're in an ongoing process of learning more about our community and about the groups that are a part of our community. And that we'll embrace an ethic of trying to be inclusive in our behavior and our statements, but that we know we're going to be vulnerable and we know we're going to make mistakes. And we'll be open to listening and learning about those mistakes and improving. And so you never reach the end with cultural humility. It's an ongoing process. But the most important thing that we embrace in embracing the notion of cultural humility is courage. The willingness to speak up and possibly make mistakes, possibly say things that people find offensive. And to be willing to listen and hear when others are hurt or injured and want to tell us why. And there's no other, in my view, important ethic, more important ethic than cultural humility for building the kind of inclusive communities that we truly want to build. That ethic that focuses us on learning from other people and being willing to engage with other people, even if the conversation is going to be difficult and painful. In my view, we've gone so far as a society. We've made such remarkable progress. Let me just make an embarrassing admission to you that I did not in any way believe that in my lifetime America would elect a black man president. I will admit that. Holy cow! Right? But I think our next progress is going to be much more intimate and personal, and will involve our interactions with other people who are a part of our community. And I see that you are all on that journey, and I congratulate you for that. And I look forward to the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. Was that not an amazing presentation? We all have a brand new word to go home with tonight: cultural humility. If everybody has a program, what I want you to do right now is take 2 or 3 minutes and open it to the center of the program. You have a little bit of homework. And I want you to sort of process what Dr. Brown said in relation to those questions. Because what we want to be able to do is that at each point in this experience, you're cataloging your impression. Because at the end, we want, when you go to do the communal art project, that you've cataloged what you felt when you heard Dr. Brown, and then after you hear this distinguished group of panelists. one more minute, we will get started with the panel. So write your last thoughts in, please. Thank you so much. Right now, what I'd like to do, we have this distinguished panel, and we only had a little bit of a paragraph on the inside, and I've got a chance to really talk to each of them this evening, and I think their stories are so impactful and powerful that I'd like each of them to introduce themselves, tell a little bit about themselves, and so forth. We're going to start with Mrs. Delorme first, and then we'll work our way down.
Good evening. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm going to hold this up. I'm kind of tall, can't reach way down there. I am the director of the Office of Human Relations for Santa Clara County Government, and I have a couple of my commissioners that are here. Still? Is that better? Okay. I'm the director of the Office of Human Relations for Santa Clara County Government, which means I run the Office of Human Relations, which is focused on human rights for all the residents of Santa Clara County, and civil rights, conflict resolution, and trying to increase the respect of inclusion, not so much diversity, because we already have diversity in our communities, to the max, in fact. But how do we create inclusion for everyone? I also staff the Human Relations Commission, which does policy work around these issues. My background is, first, I have a bachelor's degree in nursing, and I was a nursing executive for quite a while. Then I got my master's in religious studies and decided to do justice work in the community, which brought me to the county about 16 years ago. And I was responsible for building the first program in the county that was focused specifically on prejudice reduction. And from there, about 5 years ago, I became the director of the office, and I do mostly policy work with the Human Relations Commission. This is work that I love. I'm fascinated by it. I cannot get enough in terms of information. I'm constantly researching about it and practicing with the communities that I serve. And really, I think one of the things I value most is building alliances between myself and other people. So it's always been an exciting journey for me.
I am not as tall as you, so I'm going to stand so you can see me and I can see you. Hi, my name is Amy Lazarus. I'm just humbled and privileged to be part of this panel and this evening, so thank you to everyone who put this together, Valerie and your team. I come to this work, I was born and raised in a community outside of Cleveland, Ohio that's 50-50 black-white. And the cool thing to do, it really was a cool thing to do, was to try out to be in the Dialogue on Race Relations Club. And high school students taught 4th and 6th grade students at a young age about stereotype and prejudice and discrimination. And of course, in order to prepare to teach the younger kids, the high schoolers had to have these conversations. And we met in each other's living rooms every week. And it changed my life. And I went to college and I was like, where's the Race Relations Club? You know, and there wasn't one, so started one there. And kind of all through life did that. And then realized, oh, this is not about kumbaya and let's all hold hands. There's a mission case for this, and there's a business case. And when people feel included, they perform better, whether that's academically in the classroom or in the workplace or in the community. So I've really been asking for about 20 years now, what's the most effective and efficient way to make inclusion the norm? And so the company I started a little over a year ago is called Inclusion Ventures. And we're on a mission to scale inclusion. And we do that in 2 ways. One is working with organizations in every sector around how and why to bring your best self and do your best work. A lot of people say, oh yes, the business case for diversity and inclusion, we know that, but there's a disconnect between that intellectual, we know we want to do that, and the behaviors that are stopping us from getting there. So Inclusion Ventures helps to bridge that gap. We also realize the majority of the world is not going through our trainings. So how do we reach the masses? So let's talk about humility, right? How do we reach the masses? Through technology, athletics, and media. And so we work on how does your worldview, also known as your implicit bias, impact the color of the emojis that are on your iPhone, right? Why were they all yellow at first and now reflect the user experience? Why are Band-Aids my skin color? Was there not a market for people who want their Band-Aids to blend into their skin? So my colleague Emily Kalalaway, and then I'll turn it over to you. My colleague Emily Kalalaway is over here at Stanford's Design School, and we work together to combine design thinking with unconscious bias. So thank you.
Thank you. Wow. I'm Diana Gibson. I was pastor at First Presbyterian Church in Palo Alto for 16 years. Then a little later, I was one of the directors, executive directors for Santa Clara County Council of Churches. I'm a Presbyterian pastor, and I currently serve in the work in the Religious Studies Department and teach in Santa Clara University. So my background, however, and I guess my reason for being invited here, thank you very much, Rabbi Lewis, wherever you are hiding right now, is my work in ecumenical and then interfaith activity throughout, there you are, throughout the community. And I have just found that to be a place of so much learning for myself. As I've worked more and more with people who, are different than the people who might attend my own parish. So stretching myself to see the world, just glimpse at what we call moral imagination, to glimpse the world through lives other than my own, has been what's called me to say yes when Rabbi Lewis asked me to be here tonight. And I hope to learn a lot.
Hello. So I am Stephanie Rabner. I am a fair housing coordinator at Project Sentinel, which is the Bay Area's largest and almost oldest probably housing discrimination organization. I came into this work by accident, actually. When I went to law school, I knew I wanted to work with low-income populations, and I knew that I wanted to do something directed at poverty reduction. And I ended up working at a fair housing organization down in LA. And then after coming up here, I luckily found Project Sentinel, where I've been working for a few years now. And for me, the reason why I kind of do this work is I think housing is essential. It's essential to inclusion, it's essential to access to healthcare, it's essential to education, it's essential to poverty reduction. And day in and day out, I do a lot of investigations of housing discrimination. And we do that on an individual level, but at a policy level, on a larger community level, these issues need addressing. And if we don't address them at this level, I feel like we aren't doing our job as a community to be inclusive, to deal with the stereotypes of the past that still linger. And so that's sort of why I was invited to come today and talk about housing and its relationship to bias and inclusive communities.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Oh, you have a thing.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jade Chow, and I'm a member of this Palo Alto community. I'm a resident. I have 2 young children. I'm also a member of the California Bar and a member of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I am a practicing attorney. But I've been on the board of the Palo Alto YMCA for about 7 years now. And I've been asked to speak to you about what does diversity look like in a nonprofit board. I have been the chair of the board as well. And I also serve in a volunteer capacity for my children's school, Aloni Elementary School. And we have hosted an after-school program for 120 students in 9 different languages, in 12 different classes, 1 day a week, with an annual income of $56,000 run entirely by a volunteer parent corps. So I'm here to tell you that there is platform in this community for bringing together and modeling for our children what diversity looks like. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. For our first question, I would like to ask you, what resources in your expertise has been useful to promote diversity and inclusion? What are the tangible items that you can say to somebody, hey, how do we start this process? Very much like how Dr. Brown spoke about cultural humility. Is there any other items that we can give the audience to say that this is a tool that we can start the dialogue?
Start. As a result of doing this work through many different eras in terms of building race relations in Santa Clara County, I've watched us really transition greatly. As the diversity has increased and we've had to acclimate to that diversity, I found that I've had to use many different tools, and now I'm having to build a whole new toolbox because of the Trumpism era that we currently live in. But one of the first things that I would recommend is getting in touch with yourself first. You know, we always want to talk about the other guy, you know, and the other guy's problem. But implicit bias is just a common thing in all of us. And we shouldn't view it either negatively or positively. It just is. But what we need to do is start exploring what it is and how it affects us. And so you could engage in IAT, which is implicit association testing. Harvard has a study online. It's free, it's confidential, and you can go there and just take as many tests as you want, as often as you like. Now, the key about it is that once you take the test, you have to kind of sit with the message that it delivers. You really have to sit with it for a while, because initially you're going to want to deny it. Okay? It's like a reflex reaction, because none of us want to be called a racist. But this test is not calling you racist, it's just telling you what your implicit biases are that you can begin to work on. Okay? So I think we can start there with yourself first, and then you can help others as you're going through your journey. Okay? And it's really an effective tool.
How do I have to go after you every time? To that, there's MTV has something called the Look Different campaign, and it's kind of the cool, hip, updated version of the implicit association test. So for you and or some of your family members, that's a great thing to take. Show of hands, I'm just curious, I mean, you're all here for an evening of implicit bias talking. So how many of you kind of consider, yeah, I know the basics, I could be up here on this panel. Okay, no, anyone? Okay, thank you. Commissioners, I would hope so. How many of you are, I'm brand new, tell me 101, what can I do here, what can I read? Okay, one brave soul, a few? Okay, great, thanks. So there's some really great resources out there in the form of TED Talks and articles. Policy Link, anything by them has some great work around equity and explaining that. Angela Glover Blackwell, who's a founder of that, really explains equity really well. Unconscious bias expert John Powell, who's also at Berkeley. I heard some bias when you said Berkeley there. I'm just, we gotta call each other in here.
Definitely biased.
And then the Perception Institute also has some really great work, especially on the impact of implicit bias on healthcare. And so if you're looking for the statistics on health, that's a place. Going along with your beautiful point about turning it internally, Glenn Singleton talks about courageous conversations on race, and there's books that you can read about it. One of the tools that he provides is thinking about, we all tend to come to these issues from one of four ways, or four of four ways. So one is, when you think about these issues, do you tend to approach it from an intellectual place? I want the statistics, I want the facts, where is that? Do you tend to approach it from a judgment, moral place? Oh, race relations, diversity, inclusion, this is the right thing to do. Do you tend to approach it from a moral, a heartfelt, this was my experience, I get very emotional and care a lot about this? And then the last one is, let's just do something about it. Why are we still talking? Let's action, action. And so as you're looking at how to do this work effectively with other people, I know that if I'm talking to someone that really approaches this from the headspace, I got to start there, even if I don't want to start there, and meet them there. So figure out where you start, and then also figure out ways to bring other people in if you're not in their quadrant.
Got 3 mics.
Well, I'm going to fess up to being the confused one on the panel because I'm a question behind Pastor Smith there. I'm still on the first question. What inspires you to care about bias? I didn't realize that's what we were supposed to ask the first time.
No, I switched the question.
Well, okay, so you're going to come back to this
Yes,
one?
I will.
Oh, okay. Well, then I won't try and sneak it in now. I was going to. I think I kind of gave away my answer to this. I teach at a Jesuit university, and we use a lot of moral imagination. It's trying to envision the world from someone else's standpoint. And it's not claiming we can do that. Obviously, we can't. But the mere idea that we think that some lives matter more than others is the first kind of hurdle we have to overcome to do any kind of this type of work. And to realize that my life may not matter more than someone else, and to imagine how the world, the way it's working now, how it might look like and feel like from one other person and then many other people's standpoints is the first step. The next step then is I'm going to pick up on what Dr. Brown said, that moral humility to then talk about, well, this is how I imagine it might feel, and find out, oh, I got it wrong. Okay, I'm going to try again. I'm going to ask you. So I'm into just that kind of dialogue conversation and being a teacher, a lot of good critical thinking.
So sort of to echo a little bit about what everyone else said, I think acceptance is really important in addressing these issues and being able to actually have a decent conversation about them. Acceptance that you're not a perfect person and that there are these biases inside you, but also acceptance that other people are not perfect and allowing them to not be perfect. Just one of the things that I encounter a lot in my work is, you get a housing provider who's like, I didn't mean to do this, but I'm not a discriminator. And one of the best ways to have that conversation with them is say, I get it. I know that's not your intent. You're not a bad person, but let's talk about what made you do this, what your thought process was, why this is not a good thing to do. And I think once you start talking to people and accepting their humanity and that they're not perfect and that you're not perfect either, you can start to have some of those conversations.
I tend to look and see what's already existing in the community. I'm not a big fan of reinventing the wheel. So when I got to school and I had a kinder, I heard about this program that was an after-school program, and I joined it and learned from it and watched other people make use of what was already in the community as a resource to make it better. And since I've been involved in the Ohlone World Language Program, it's grown from, I think, 6 classes to 12. And it's gone from 6 languages to 9. So similarly at the Y, I'm also trying to use what's already available in the community. The Y has been around since before the Transcontinental Railroad. And in Palo Alto and in Silicon Valley, it's the oldest nonprofit. So there's no reason to reinvent anything, but make use of what's already there, the structures. Yes, some of it is antiquated and outdated and needs to be updated, but I think your best shot with the busyness of your lives is to make use of what's already here.
I
Dr. Brown?
Yeah, these are wonderful comments. There are a couple of resources I wanted to direct you to. The 2 psychologists who designed the IAT, Mahzarin Banaji and Tony Greenwald, have a book that is a really good book called Blind Spot, in which they summarize their decades-long research on implicit bias. There is an institute at Ohio State University called the Kirwan Institute, Kirwan, and they publish updated reviews of research on implicit bias. And so you can download for free their report that will take you right there. And it's just a wonderful report. One thing that report and Blind Spot both note is that, you know, one thing we might hope for is that there's something we could do that could get rid of our biases, right? Something, you know, a meditation, something. And by the way, it turns out that this is a hot area of research, and they are finding things. So for example, it turns out that mindfulness training, meditation, it turns out it does reduce implicit biases temporarily. Imagining what it would be like if you were a member of a discriminated against group. You know, what would it be like? It turns out that kind of imagination can also reduce your implicit bias. So if you take the IAT and you previously displayed a bias, engaging in this kind of activity for long enough reduces the bias temporarily, right? And one way to think about implicit biases is not simply about what you learned as a child. We are continually represented with stereotypes, with representations of people that reify existing stereotypes and that help maintain the implicit biases that we have. And so the lesson I take from that is that what we have to do better is to recognize that there are likely to be times that our biases and stereotyping are likely to influence our actions, our perceptions, and our judgments, and to put in place practices that counter them. So when you have a position where you are hiring people, it means ensuring that in your search for candidates, you are actively seeking candidates from diverse backgrounds. It means questioning what are the characteristics of a strong performer for this particular position? What are the attributes that are truly associated with strong performance? So, for example, in my other position, I'm the Graduate Diversity Recruitment Officer for the School of Humanities and Sciences. And one of the things that we do a workshop for faculty and staff serving on graduate admissions committees. And what we encourage them to do is to carry out their own studies on the factors that are associated with success in the graduate program. Don't let your lore, anecdotes, presumptions guide your judgments. Carry out the studies yourself, right? And that can be a way to reduce the impact of biases and negative stereotypes.
Thank you all for those astute answers. The next question we would like to ask is a two-sided question, and it's more about personal interaction. What if somebody is the person that is on the receiving end of implicit bias? How do they react and navigate that situation? Also, how does the person that is doing the implicit bias, how do they deal with somebody confronting them with that? What are those things that are going to make this dialogue not be, there will be tension because somebody's bringing up something, but how do we move this from a tense dialogue to a healthy dialogue?
In all the work that I've done these last 22 years, I think this is the one that I've focused on most. One must be courageous to share with another person that you've been impacted by implicit bias. It does take courage because our society has, in a way, told us that we're supposed to kind of minimize the effect on ourselves. Take it in for ourselves and get over it, okay? So we swallow it if we're the constant victim or the constant target of microaggressions. We kind of swallow it. It takes courage to step out of that and in the moment say to another person when they have targeted you, whether it was intentionally or not, this is what happened to me. What you just said or what you just did affected me this way. Okay? That takes courage. But at the same time, you're entering into a conversation once you say that. And that means you, as the target, must remain curious rather than enter into the zone of anger. So if you are openly curious and you ask questions rather than making accusations, you will be able to have a conversation. It's very important that you engage in that kind of conversation in a kind of a confidential space. You don't want to expose that conversation to other people, because then they rise to another situation. They have an audience. And pride enters into the fact. So conversations like this can really happen, but you have to be courageous, and you really do have to remain curious. And then the next thing you have to do, if the person tells you things that you know are factually inaccurate, you have to actually correct that. You have to give them other examples of why it's not true. Okay? And then finally, when you get to the point to where you feel like you're kind of comfortable with each other about talking about what happened, you have to actually be bold enough to say that for me, I would rather you didn't do that again, that I would really like for you to think about what we just talked about and try to see if you can prevent it from happening again, in particular with me. Because the fact of the matter is we're all engaged in this. This is really a part of who we are, being human. There's no expectation that we're going to get inoculation. It's just going to go away. So it's lifelong work. And you can only be accountable for yourself. So that's why I tend to limit that conversation between the person and myself and not make it a global issue. Okay?
So the prompt was about dialogue. I used to work at an organization called the Sustained Dialogue Institute, and our founder just recently passed away. Hal Saunders helped to negotiate the Camp David Peace Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli Peace Treaty. And his definition of dialogue includes listening deeply enough to be changed by what you hear. And right now, I feel very listened to. Your eyes are on me. Thank you so much. How often are we listening so that we can be the next person to talk? Listen so that we can tell someone why they're wrong, right? And so in this exchange, when someone tells you, this is what happened to me when you did this, to really be able to listen deeply enough to be changed by what you hear, to be able to say those three favorite little words, tell me more, right? Especially if you disagree, oh, that's not right. Don't get defensive, right? So if you're the one being approached, how can you take a breath and take a beat and then do the tell me more thing and have an open, curious stance? If you're the one that's doing the approaching, which is just, it's so hard. And we know that there are those of us who tend to be the approachers more than the approachees. And why is it always our responsibility? And what does that look like, especially for women and people of color and LGBTQ, right, and lower socioeconomic? So what does that look like to always do? And I would say to recognize when you don't have it in you. And it's okay. Because sometimes you just don't have it in you. And you're still a good person, and you can go on the next day and maybe do it the next day. And when you are doing it, to be able to call people in instead of calling people out. So we don't want to say, you're racist, or don't say that, right? You want to be able to say exactly what Delorme said. I said your name right? Okay. To really make it an inviting learning opportunity instead of a chastisement. I will learn.
Okay. So I actually prefer the word curious. I had the word clarify, but curious is really wonderful. Just to ask the question, is this what you meant to say? Can you understand how it might be interpreted in another way? And what were you trying to say? To again, not the calling people's names, but trying to pull them out. And a sense that I know that a statement of faith. I would put. I know that we can have a conversation better than this, or we can have our interactions can be better than this, and if you are the one who did the implicit bias, which is a role I have certainly been in, to breathe, I like that, and to say, tell me more about what how that impacted you. Help me understand. And do your defensiveness later. I mean, it's totally natural to feel defensive and say, I didn't mean that, and you know how many marches I've gone on. I'm sorry, I'm being honest here. Yeah, just hypothetical, right. And I think it's just natural, and it needs to get out of my system later. But that's at home with my husband. You know, at the time, I need to just shut that off and try and listen, to really listen more. And then I also appreciate when there's, as a teacher, when the information is incorrect, we need to kind of pull that out and say, okay, what are you talking about? And because I teach in religious studies, what I get confronted with a lot is not so implicit, but biased about Judaism and Islam. And so I try and pull that out, and what I say then is, I'm glad you brought that up, because that's some misinformation that's out there, and now we need to talk about it. And I'm sure that can work in others. But to affirm that what someone said, they learned from somewhere else, they didn't usually make it up themselves, they learned from someone else, and say, thank you for bringing that up, because we need to clarify that that's not true. And then to go ahead and not be shy about offering the information. And then the final one I have is to make it I statements, and that's been said already. This is how I felt. Yeah, thank you.
I'm definitely guilty of maybe overcorrecting facts. I'm very big on correcting facts, but I recognize that not everybody wants to hear that, and not everybody's in the frame of mind to hear that. And so I think as someone who has experienced a microaggression, I think you have to be okay with recognizing and saying, maybe this isn't the right time to have this conversation with this person. Maybe they're in a bad mood. Maybe, they're stressed out. Maybe I've said something and it's just gonna get really heated if we can continue this conversation, and we just need to step away and think. But on that end, if that's who you are at that time and you can't have that conversation and at that moment, and if you're on the receiving end of the criticism, essentially, make a point to go back and have that conversation. Not being in the mood for it doesn't mean you get out of it. And I mean, just be open. And I keep going back to the idea of acceptance and accepting that you're not a perfect person, and we're all flawed, and we should all welcome a criticism to become better people. And if you don't agree with their facts, go look them up.
So one of the things that I notice is it starts to happen in elementary school and middle school, and it's called bullying. I don't know how many people in the audience are familiar with the Project Cornerstone. If you are, please raise your hand. Okay, great. So it's a project of the Y, and we've been doing it for several years now. Started with a survey in the schools to try to determine what are the factors that are making students successful or not successful, social and emotionally. And there's a whole set of materials now developed called the 41 assets. And each of these assets address a particular trait of a worldview from the student's perspective. And now the program is well entrenched in many public schools up and down the valley, also here in Palo Alto. And I'm so excited to hear at the breakfast last week that the material is now being translated into Spanish so that it can go into Spanish-speaking communities. And so I raised my hand and I talked to Anne, who is the Project Cornerstone CEO. I said, hey, can we get this in Mandarin too? And she said, write me an email, let's talk. So If we can get to our kids early enough and talk to them about these things, and also give them the tools that, as adults, that we still need to continue to sharpen, I think it's a great beginning and very useful for them no matter what they end up choosing to do. And again, making those resources that are already available in our community, just make them better.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to ask that this be our last closing question. So I'm going to ask the question, then ask you to give your closing remarks. We like to give the audience an opportunity to have feedback. So at 8:30, we're going to go into questions from everybody in the audience. So if you've been holding it in, you can get it out in about 10 minutes. So this is my question. As a bystander, I see somebody that's receiving microaggression. Whether I know the person that's doing it or I don't know the person that's doing it, how do I handle that? Because a lot of us see this happening, and good people sometimes stay quiet because they don't have the tools to deal with it. And also add your little closing about how you see the future of this working through our community.
A few things to say about that. I think bystanders can have a very powerful impact because what you can do is validate the perspective of the target in a way that it may make it easier for a microaggressor to sort of to consider that. But I think using I statements is still appropriate here to say, you know, I heard what you said, and I like this language. You know, I know you probably didn't intend this, but here's how I heard it. I'm afraid she might have heard it that way too. But you know, I know you probably didn't intend it, but see, this is how it might have been heard, and you know, maybe we could talk about a different way to approach it in the future that might reduce that because I know you don't want people to come to that impression. It's sort of an approach that presumes good intentions on the part of the actor that I think can be really, really powerful. And I'll say, just as far as where the future is going, I was talking about the last honor student that I worked with who did a thesis in which she talked about the limits of tolerance. And the way she talked about tolerance is this, that Americans have embraced this notion of tolerance as a way of sort of accepting diversity. And the idea is that I don't understand you, I don't know what y'all are about, but as long as you stay over there doing your thing and you don't interfere in my thing, that's fine. And that's not going to work anymore. Our communities are becoming more diverse, and diversity is a fact, inclusion is a practice, and it's going to depend on our embracing what my honor student said was acceptance, embracing that as American citizens we have a responsibility to learn about other groups and to extend ourselves. But simple sort of tolerance, that's just not going to work anymore. So it goes back to this cultural humility and embracing, in some ways, I'll use another Stanford psychologist, Carol Dweck, embracing a growth mindset around diversity and inclusion, and saying, boy, I've got to devote time and effort to learning more and doing better. I think that's where we're going.
Okay, everything he just said, plus, there's still the target, okay? And sometimes when you're the bystander, you also have to take care of the target. Sometimes it's not the moment to confront the person who's projecting their implicit bias. And so you have to really observe objectively what is really going on between the parties that are having that conversation. I found that in some cases it was just not the time to talk to the person that was projecting. But the person who was the target, when that person that was projecting walks away, they need comfort. Because one of the things about being the target is microaggressions happen all the time to targets. And they feel isolated. And if you can stand with them in compassion and comfort them, it also gives them courage to stand up for themselves. And then you can actually have that conversation about courage. You can teach them something about what we've just said about how do you respond to a perpetrator when you're the victim. A lot of people that are targets, they're just tired. They're tired of being the target. But the isolation is the thing that is the most painful. Okay? So if you can stand up with that person, say to them, you saw, you heard, you felt, and that you understand they're probably feeling something too. Would they like to talk about it? Compassion is an important thing, and people need allies so badly these days. You know, we have to stop thinking of ourselves as individuals. We have to start seeing ourselves as being part of a collective, a community that needs to take care of one another.
Delorme makes it sound so easy. Write down what she said so that in the moment, seriously, in the moment, you're startled. Wait, was that that person's target? What am I supposed to say to them again, right? To be able to go up and to say, I felt, I saw, did you? To just do that in the moment. And by thinking of the pre-work in this is as important as the during work and the post-work. Because if you commit to yourself that you are someone who is not a bystander, you're an upstander, right? You go when there's an issue. And if you commit to yourself and practice that now, then you're more likely to do it, which means that you're more likely to make inclusion a practice, which is so critical. And in those moments when I do this work for a living, and then in the moments when I don't want to do it, I think, all right, the cost of not doing this. I know the biggest cost of wasted resources, according to Harvard Business Review, is navigating the second job. Navigating the second job is things like saying, did they say that to me because I'm a woman? Would they have said that to her if she weren't a lesbian? Is that only because he's in a wheelchair? It's that second, I'm seeing some heads nod, it's that second train of thought. And I'm seeing some heads not nodding, which makes me wonder, do you know what I'm talking about? Or have you ever experienced this? Or might you have colleagues or family members who do, right? So what does that look like? So the pre-work is as important as in the moment to commit to doing it. I think about the bystander for the intention versus impact on a few levels as well. So one is, so many times I've heard people say, oh, what are you? And it's not to me, it's to someone who does not look white. And what are you? And it might be coming from a possible good intention, right? So actually going through what's a possible good intention where this person's coming from. They want to relate to you, they want to find something in common, but a possible negative impact is that that's the only thing you see. And I worked with a student who was asked every single day, 7 times a day, what are you? And she's from Afghanistan, and her head was wrapped. And she ended up dropping out of school, moving schools, because it was literally impacting her ability to learn. So when you're coming from a place of privilege, even if it's well-intended to ask someone, don't. Or take a step back and think, okay, well, what's my intention behind this? What's another way to do it? So part of this is the preventing some of the bystander stuff. In terms of the future, how can you lead from where you are? And so whether that's raising your hand to say, hey, let's get this in Mandarin, or whether that's, you know what, I'm going to be interviewing people, let me meditate for 2 minutes. And all you gotta do for that is focus on your breathing in and breathing out for 2 minutes before you're interviewing someone, because even though it only reduces bias temporarily, maybe you'll make a different decision in that moment. I work with someone who's an executive assistant to a CEO, and she is in control of the calendar. So how does she lead from where she is? She decides, and has talked about this with her boss, by the way, transparency and communication, who's getting the meetings. It's in Washington, D.C., where there's quadrants, and most of the people in one quadrant are higher socioeconomic status and whiter than other people in other quadrants, right? And so if she sees, okay, all these people here from Northwest, let's get some other meetings on the books here, that's another way to lead from where you are, to make inclusion a practice. So I invite you to think about whether it's on a daily basis or where you are with your organizations, who are you calling into your community, and how can you continue to lead from where you are to create this community that you want to be part of.
Thank you. So the question actually said, what is an effective role for a bystander? And I wrote, don't be. Don't be a bystander, be an ally. Be someone with some compassion or someone who's willing to stand in solidarity. I come from the conviction, as from my tradition, that each and every human being is made in the image of God. And that is in many traditions, and if you're not a person of faith, the chances are you still hold, and most people I know do, vast majority of humanity holds a sense of the sacredness of each human being. And remember that when you're in that position, and know that you do not ever want to stand by when that sacredness is being trampled. Something sacred is being trampled when someone experiences that kind of bias. And we do not want to be bystanders for that. Then we have to learn from these wonderful other people effective ways to move forward. But first, I think we have to come from the conviction of who we want to be. And I believe none of us want to be bystanders when a part of God, a part of something sacred is being trampled. Mother Teresa says that most of the ills in the world can come from the root cause that we have forgotten that we belong to each other. So another thing that I just sometimes remember, I mean, I'm a mom. Would I want that kind of bias focused against my child? Would I be a bystander when that's going on? No way. Think of anyone you love and think if you would allow them to be the recipient of that kind of bias. And then follow what seems like, as you said, there are times that we need to be the bystanders, the allies, the non-bystanders, need to be the ones who address it in some of the effective ways we've talked about. And there's other times when we go afterwards and talk to the recipient of the bias. Often we're called to do both. The one thing I would add that I find helpful is when I do talk to the recipient is to say, do you wish I would have handled that differently? Because I'm still learning and they may. Yeah, I think that's.
So many microphones. So in terms of bystanders, there's sort of two thoughts to that I have. One is, if it's someone you know, be a friend. The people that I consider closest to me and the closest to friends are people who can tell me things I don't want to hear. So be that person for as many people in your life that you can be. You're in the perfect position to tell people things that they might not want to hear. And frankly, nobody wants to be accused of bias. The second thing is, don't care what people think about you. No, I'm serious. I know that there's a lot of fear in approaching someone who you may not know about something that you heard them say. And usually it's, at least for me, it's, well, they're going to think I'm strange, and who is this random woman talking to me and telling me not to do this or that? What I said was inappropriate. Don't care. It's your job as someone who is a citizen of humanity and who wants to improve this world to just speak up and say something. With that being said, in terms of the future, the second part of the question, I think that there's a lot of promise in the Bay Area. I think that we have a lot of diverse communities and people from around the world. But I think that there needs to be a conversation about what it means to be diverse, diverse and what it means to be inclusive. Are we actually interacting with each other? Because I know I've lived in Santa Clara for 5 years, and this is about as diverse of a room I've ever been in. And I run in pretty diverse circles, given the work I do. And so my call is to challenge yourself to take a hard look at your community and who you interact with, and ask whether or not you're separate but diverse, or diverse and together. And if you want to be that second part, we need to work, and we need to work quickly to maintain that togetherness connected to diversity, and we need to speak up, and we need to scale it up. Because as I see it, and I'm sure a lot of people would probably agree, is we're kind of drifting apart in our communities. And we come together for this, but do we live together? Do we go to church together? Do we shop at the same grocery store? So think about that and how you can actually address those issues.
So I want to share a story with you about my grandmother. I think this indirectly answers your question and projects to the future. I am my grandmother's granddaughter, you can say. My grandmother was born into a very wealthy family in China, but that didn't last very long because a plague swept through her village and everyone died, including her parents. So she got shipped to a distant relative in a different city. And at the age of about 16, she ran away from home because nobody really cared about her so much, but they wanted her to marry a cousin who was very ill. So she said, I'm not going for that. But when she left, 2 world wars were breaking out. World War I broke out first, and then World War II. And through her experiences, she was discriminated in many different ways by many different people. And by the time I got to know her as my grandmother, she had survived the bombings in Nanjing. She had traveled to Taiwan in '49. She had married and had 2 children, but her husband died, so she widowed at the age of 38. And so she was trying to raise a family in a war-stricken environment, and she was very self-sufficient. So when she was my grandmother, I watched her and watched what she did. And I learned from her that no matter what happens in your environment, and things will happen, you just gotta figure it out and go on and be choosing that it's the right thing to do and the optimistic thing to do. And she had her own garden. She brought seeds with her from the old country so she could plant her own vegetables. And she put kitchen scraps in a barrel before organic gardening was very popular. She used the stomach and innards of fish to fertilize her rose garden. So her roses were huge. And now, in my 40s, I find that I'm doing what she's doing. I have a plot at the community garden behind Rinconada. I planted strawberries and cucumbers and onions for my children yesterday. And I find that it doesn't matter what the environment is, because the biases or implicit biases will always be there. But you gotta have grit. You gotta have the will to survive and to make your environment good and better. Because, you know, sometimes people aren't gonna help you because they can't. Not that they don't want to. And it's really up to yourself to make the best of what you have and navigate yourself towards people who care, a caring community, and work together.
I failed to answer the second part of the question, and I really want to have an opportunity to do that. Our commission has launched a new initiative we started about 2 years ago, and it's called a Human Rights Initiative. And what we're working on is getting the county of Santa Clara to become a human rights county. And already within the county, we're being joined by other cities who are trying to get themselves established as human rights cities. The last week of October, on Thursday and Friday, there's going to be the first human rights conference here in Santa Clara County. It's going to be at San Jose State. It's a collaboration between our commission and any other commission who wants to join us in Santa Clara County and San Jose State and the Statewide Association of Human Rights Organizations. We're really excited about it. It's a 2-day conference. We welcome people to join us. It's going to be a lively conversation for 2 days. A lot of students are going to be with us as well, so that will really make it a lively conversation. So pay attention when we send out the announcement in the next couple of weeks, and please do join us because it will be talking about the future here in Santa Clara County and the human dignity of all the people and how we can approach everyone with that sense of human dignity for everyone. Okay? Thank you.
Can we put our hands together for this fine panel? They did an amazing job for us tonight. Thank you so much. Here goes audience participation. As I stated earlier, this is an official meeting of the City of Palo Alto. If you have a question, we ask that you please fill out the card that I'm holding upside down. Please fill out the card. We have Minka and Mary. Can you put your hands up? They will be carrying the mic around. Do we have any questions? And did you? Okay, thank you so much. Lars Johnson.
Good evening. Thank you very much. I was a little surprised that this panel on bias was mostly focused about adult issues. And I think a lot of adults can help themselves. What I'd be interested in to get your perspective on bias in schools. And many of you probably agree that most of us aren't born with biases. And what subconscious bias does to our children in schools, specifically when perpetrated by the teachers, by laning subconsciously and separating different groups based on their expectations of what the child should be capable of, not by its true potential.
Anybody can take the question, please.
One of the things that I'm concerned about when I work in schools is that our education seems to be more focused on nationalism than it is on who we really are as a people and how many different people have contributed to what it is to be human here. You don't find it in the textbooks. And so students go and they feel, again, isolated as they go through our K through 12 education process. And we haven't spent a lot of time educating teachers on how to deal with implicit bias at all. They're afraid, in fact, to talk about implicit bias because they think they're going to get it wrong. We have to make an investment in that kind of an education because it doesn't happen when they're becoming a teacher. And we have to feel that it's just as important as STEM. That learning to be a good person, how to be in good relationships is really as critical as learning how to do math and science. Because even when you enter those fields, if you cannot relate to other people, it takes you a long time to get to the objective. I also think that schools need to be more welcoming of groups like yours, like mine, and many others who really want to go into the schools, who are funded, in fact, to do so. And we just want some space. Just give us a little space so that we can work with the kids and work with the teachers. I'm hopeful that's going to happen in the near future. We're just not there yet. We see a lot of suffering among kids right now. I mean, it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. You know, it could be class, it could be anything. It could be size, height, speech pattern, you know, any kind of ability or marginal disability or significant disability. We're having a hard time and we're still dealing with our children as other if they're not in that perfect little category. So what I think I'm saying to you is that we've got to make the commitment. We've got to say to schools that this is as important as STEM. Learning how to relate to each other is critical if we're going to be successful. And we're just not there yet.
Thank you. We're just going to ask one panelist to answer since we're short on time. Can we get Melissa Curver?
It's Melissa Curvin. So, I agree with what Lars just said because, I was actually going to bring up the same issue that our most vulnerable are our children. And if I'm more concerned less with how the children deal with each other, but with how the teachers deal with the children, because that sets the tone. But I also, I spoke with somebody before the program began today about the fact that the people who are here are not necessarily the ones who need to hear this. It's all the rest in our community who are not here. I don't know if there's anybody here from the Palo Alto Police Department. In general, I think they've done well, but there are issues. And it came out one day in my church service. One person brought up something, and then another, and then another, and another. And there are so many stories about people being ill-treated by our Palo Alto Police Department. So I don't know if you have any recommendations, but I'm thinking more training for the school administrators, for our police department. But then how do we get into the wider community, to the people who aren't here tonight?
Anybody want to field that?
I'll take that. I don't represent the police department, but I would say that there are changes that are happening already, and I can speak to at least one specific example. In my son's 6th grade class, the English teacher had them read a book called Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. And it's a book about the Deep South, and it was a 6-week project where the students were first read the book and then discussed in different ways and then asked to write small essays. And then after the 6 weeks ended, the teacher invited parents to come in to the classroom and have a discussion about race issues, because it was very uncomfortable that she was even teaching this book, much less have parent participation. But the result was a lot of people came forward and wanted to talk about this, and they didn't know if it was okay to talk to the teacher about this. But when the teacher actually brought it up and communicated to the parent community, it was very well received. So I do think that there are changes that are happening. I'm not sure that it's happening at every school, but certainly there are pockets. And if you find those pockets, get involved, go do something, make it more widespread.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask that both the panelists and the questionnaires keep their comments to about 1 minute to 2 minutes, just because we want to allow everybody to have a chance to speak. Patricia Giffrin.
Hi. So I can appreciate making inclusion a practice in that kind of private work and reflecting and looking at our own implicit bias. However, in a sense that feels a little too focused on the individuals. If you're practicing, you usually have a sangha, a community to go to express then, hey, well, the other day I did this and then this happened, So it's always about sharing, because we're not human alone. And we're not in this alone. And it's manifests in our laws, it's manifest in our institutions, et cetera, et cetera. This is our policies. This is where it's manifest. So my question is, taking this from the private individual work to then the Sangha, the community, how then can people work together on a community policy, on a community, because there is where the rubber hits the road. That's when it comes out. That's when we can be human. Implicit bias also is just how we learn and navigate the world. But when we're making something together to make a more equitable policy, to make a more equitable law, whatever, that's it. That's where I'm kind of, and I think, yeah.
Anybody want to deal with the policy question?
I'll take that 1 minute one. So I'll go back for a moment to Hal Saunders, a Sustained Dialogue founder, who said that only governments can create treaties, only people can create peace. And so what is the role? I think it's still the both and. So let's get the people who are making these policies to be held accountable and aware of what is your worldview? How is that impacting the policies you're creating? Is there an extra layer, an extra step to go through an empathy building process to figure out whose voice is not in the room or whose voices are in the room, and therefore what perspectives may or may not be missing? I think it still comes down to the people making that the new norm. And so would love to talk with you afterwards about where you see that. Where is your community of practice, and whether that's at your Sangha or in your workplace, or investing a chunk of time, whether it's a 1 day or a 3 day or an offsite, saying this is going to be our new norm, and then how will we implement that moving forward, so that when you're in the midst of making the new policy, everyone knows where this is coming from, to be able to really build and strengthen those muscles.
Thank you so much. Lynn H.
Hi, my name is Lynn Heidekofer, and I tell people just call me Lynn because my last name's complicated. I'm really glad to see the city council members and the Palo Alto Human Rights Commission, Human Relations Commission, addressing this topic, because a couple of years ago I was involved with the homeless, and there was a ban against the homeless in their cars, and the HRC never did a forum on it. And I think we could have prevented the ban had the HRC addressed the issue with the neighbors and the homeless themselves. So I've noticed in Palo Alto Weekly, which does fabulous coverage, Sue Dreaman in particular, that the HRC is running a whole series of working with the various groups. So I'm hoping that our name on the list here, that we'll all be apprised of when the next one was, and hopefully they will address every ethnic group, cultural group in Palo Alto, because it's mainly a wealthy white population.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Can we get Kate?
My name's Kate Pinus. I thought that, Dr. Brown, when you brought up that this work has to be done in sort of an intimate and personal way, so true, but also very daunting, because fostering these positive conversations among a lot of people is seems more efficient, I guess, but way harder. And I think that people and I think what everyone brought up this evening about being courageous is also very important, because I find so often that people are scared of talking about these subjects because they are sort of aware of this concept of implicit bias, but and therefore are very scared of showing their own implicit bias. And so this is probably not a good question, because there's probably no good answer. But how do we foster these conversations on a much larger scale, and not just when someone displays their implicit bias, because people do get defensive, and maybe we want to start talking about it at an earlier stage, whether that be in an elementary school, but also among adults as well. So how do we have more conversations like this?
I want to say one thing briefly, that I'd like to hear what my panelists who have been doing this out in the world, not just the academy, would have to say. But, how do I frame, there's a counter narrative that we would do well to actively dispute. And it's a narrative that says, oh, being sensitive to these issues is just being politically correct. Right? And I think that's very dangerous. And I think actively combating that and arguing that in our more diverse society, try to learn more about communities and engage with them in a positive way, that's just being a good member of the community. And it's not being politically correct, because in fact, it is about being honest and learning and growing and accepting that we may not know everything and we may be wrong. So I'm really concerned about that narrative and how popular it is right now, because I think it's part of a larger message to call into question efforts to create a more socially just society and community. So I think combating that narrative is really important.
Thank you so much. Eunice Lee.
Hi, so my question deals with starting a conversation in open dialogue with someone. Let's say that you muster up the courage to begin a dialogue with someone who is projecting their unconscious biases that's having a negative impact on you or somebody that you know, but the person that you want to start the conversation with is either in denial about these unconscious biases or unwilling to start this conversation. Do you have any thoughts or input to share with us in terms of how we can help kickstart that conversation and begin that honest dialogue?
Well, yes. Not everyone is going to be on board, and that's just the truth of the matter. So, several of us have mentioned language that I think can help you in engaging that person. But I think we have to accept that some people are just not going to want to engage with you, and you can only do what you can, and if it doesn't work, then I think you sort of have to accept that and try to learn as much as you can from it. But that's a message from my colleague Jericka Blackman too, that not everyone is going to be able to join you on this journey.
I also can tell you there are miracles. I've had really difficult conversations with people who just could not take this information in, and then a year or two later, I see that person, and suddenly they tell me, thank you for having that conversation with me. I can actually tell you it's happened to me so many times. So it may not stick in the moment, they'll be in denial, they'll fight you, but because you were truthful and compassionate in sharing that truth, it lingers in the body somehow. It may not stay in the rational mind, that's where we want to kick it out. But somehow it penetrates the heart, it lingers in the body, and it just resonates there. And then the work is done.
I was just going to echo her and say plant the seed, and then you have to have some faith, but go ahead and plant the seed. Do it with compassion, but plant the seed, and you're right. People come back later. You never know. 5 years later.
Thank you. And we have one last question from Maria Angela.
I know we live in, I live in many countries, and now I am here, and I find this a very unique community, but the numbers in the election, it scares me. So I feel like in a bubble in a way, so the numbers tells me I do live here, but there is something here that I don't know, and it's out there, and maybe now we are more open to say because the numbers are showing. And so those discussions, I think, is very important. And the other thing is, I know 2 questions, may I? Yeah. The other one is, I know is inside this community, we see a lot of ghost houses. So people are investing, but they are not investing their lives in the community. So those ghost houses, they will change the community, and they are already changing. So what we can do about it, that's as scary as well as the election. Okay.
Thank you so much.
What do you mean by ghost houses? Like foreign investors?
But they don't actually live in them, so they call it ghost house.
Yes, but you have to fill out a card. Promise me, please.
Yeah, also just to add to the housing, like the 1-2 punch that has happened to the African American community with the predatory lending, with the foreclosure crisis, and now with the rents in this area just, skyrocketing. So a lot of people are getting pushed into the Central Valley, and we're losing the diversity there.
Thank you so much. And Stephanie,
Yes.
right up your alley.
Yes, this is very true. And it's happening all over the Bay Area, and we see it regularly. And I think the way that you address that is, so the way people have been thinking about that question is they've been saying affordable housing, affordable housing, affordable housing. Affordable housing isn't coming anytime soon, or it's coming, it's just not coming soon enough. And so how do you preserve what we have now, at least what we have left of what that diversity is, before it all goes away? And people come from different schools of thoughts, but I think that there needs to be a conversation about how to address displacement on the community level. Some people say rent stabilization. Some people say just cause eviction. Some people say let's do smaller affordable housing projects. Some people say let's have an ordinance where, landlords have to take a Section 8 voucher. I mean, it's really community driven, but if you're interested in preserving what diversity is left in your community, you have to address displacement now. Because right now what we're seeing is everybody's fleeing to South San Jose. They're fleeing further south. They're fleeing out into the valley. And there's gonna come a point where we've re-ghettoized our population. And it's already starting to happen. And I mean, I can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you where to start.
Well, can we thank our panelists, Palo Alto? I just want to say all of this comes with a lot of work, and I'd like to recognize a few people. Shelley Gordon from the Human Relations Commission. Rabbi Sheldon Lewis, raise your hand. Minka. And the person who really drove this process, Valerie Stringer. And I'd like to bring up Councilman Corey Wallenbeck. He's going to close us out this evening. But Palo Alto, you asked a question, how does the conversation get wider? You leave this room and you tell somebody. And you show courage in having hard conversations at the soccer field, at Pete's, Phil's, what's the other one, Blue Bottle? But have those conversations, because if good people don't talk, then who will? Oh, please, please, please. Ted, he's a student at Pali High. He did an amazing job on this video. I want you to go see this video. I saw it today for the first time. And when you hear these stories, I feel it will crystallize what we're talking about tonight. So Corey, if you could come forward.
Thank you. And let's hear another round of applause for Pastor Smith. And let's also give it up for all of our panelists. And our amazing keynote, Dr. Brown. I know we already said it, but once again, for Valerie, the Human Relations Commission, and their staff, of course, Minka and Mary, who just do a wonderful job. I don't want to take a whole lot of time. We've had a lot of great comments here tonight. I've learned a ton, but I just want to talk about a couple quick things: humility, empathy, and next steps. When it comes to humility, just a couple thoughts on this. One, there's an old story apocryphal story probably about a Zen master. A guy goes to see a Zen master to learn about Zen. Sits down, they have tea, and the Zen master fills the guy's teacup, and they're talking, and then before the guy's had any of his tea, the Zen master pulls out the teapot, starts pouring more tea in. It just starts pouring all over the table, and the guy says, "Well, what are you doing?" My cup's already full. He says, "Well, how can I teach you about Zen if your cup's already full?" So, another approach, so-called Western science, and I'm a huge fan of science, and no, I'm not Buddhist myself, but in science really is all about humility. It's all about intellectual humility. There's an implicit humility in science, both a prefix and a suffix. The prefix in science that's implicit is based on the current research, and then whatever you're saying. There's also an implicit suffix that's humble, which is, and I could be wrong. Future research might prove me wrong. My researcher is somebody else, and I invite them to go do that. So there's an implicit humility at the start and at the end of every scientific statement, of every piece of scientific research. Now, how many people here have ever heard somebody, so we heard a little bit about this before, how many people here have heard somebody complain about some injustice they suffered or some microaggression or something that they thought they were feeling, and you thought, man, it's all in their head? I've done it too. Well, everything's in our head. I mean, if I said, after this election this fall, when Trump gets elected, America is going to be great again, and a lot of you are going to get what's coming. If I were to say something like that, you'd probably feel something. Oh, but it's all in your head. And no, that's not something I would actually say with seriousness, just a thought experiment, so before you quote me on it. But the point is, we've got to be humble, right? Every tradition teaches us that. Now, when it comes to empathy, how do we do that? How do we develop empathy? I think that humility helps lead to that. I think it's important that we're humble and that we're empathetic about ourselves, recognizing that we're not perfect. Heard about that tonight. Being empathetic about the people we interact with. Empathetic about the people we observe. If we're the third party bystander who's about to become an upstander, to be empathetic about the person who we perceive as committing a microaggression or an overt aggression, and to be empathetic about the person who might need a friend. But to recognize, it's an old quote, and I can't remember who originally said it, but be kind to everyone you meet, because they're all carrying a heavy burden. Me, you, the third person, the fourth person they're talking to, all of us. So I guess as I was listening to this tonight, I was kind of putting together like a flow chart that if we are consciously, culturally humble, that can lead us to be a little bit more open, and that can lead us to a little bit of empathy, because we can see the humanity in other people. And if we see that humanity and we act based on recognizing that humanity, hopefully we can transcend our bias. Now, as far as next steps, we've all been invited to responding to those questions in your pamphlet. There are a bunch of sticky notes over here and boards. So before you leave, I'd encourage you, please fill one out. You don't have to put your name on it. It can be anonymous. Answer any of those questions that you want. And you can also, on a sticky note, if you want to, you can also put down, if you have an idea for a future forum similar to this that could be hosted by the AHRC. They're very interested in hearing your thoughts on what the next topic or two topics could be. And you can either put that up or you can give it to any member of the HRC. But I'll tell you right now what I'm going to put on my note. One of the questions is, I hope for Palo Alto. And I hope Palo Alto will become a place where we courageously look into the mirror of introspection. Next step, after you put the sticky note up, go out there, do some introspection, be self-aware, and lead from where you are. And by the way, one last thank you. Thank you for coming and being the best of Palo Alto.